Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all here, students, faculty, colleagues, but most especially the members of our advisory board who are here for today and tomorrow for their annual meetings. And to have this occasion to present to you this really exciting new initiative of the Kellogg Institute that we've been working on for a while, that in many ways has been the fruit of some of the advice and discussions that the advisory board has been having with us for a number of years, these new policy and practice labs, something that also connects us in an important way to the developments of the Keough School as a whole. So this is their first public presentation of them. It's only formally been launched now in the last couple of weeks, as you know, and so this is our first opportunity to hear from those who will be leading these four new initiatives here. But I won't be the one presenting them to you. I'm just here to give the floor over to my longtime treasured friend, who I now have the privilege of being a colleague of in the context of the Keough School for this year, Ambassador Susan Page. Susan.
Thank you very much, Paolo. And we were just joking that although I've spent most of my career overseas, I see him less now that I'm actually on the campus of Notre Dame than I did when I lived in Africa. So, but it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really thrilled to be on the campus of Notre Dame for this year as a visiting professor of the practice. So let's get down to it. We have four labs that we think are really exciting. This is an opportunity for them to showcase the work that is really focused on maintaining a focus on vigorous scholarly inquiry and research, but also with a focus on integral human development. So we're going to jump right in. Each of the labs has a specific focus. I'll just briefly mention what they are, and then I'll turn it over to the first faculty fellow who will talk. But the first one is the Initiative for International Economic Integration. The second one is Integral Human Development Lab. The third one is Reparations Compliance Lab. And the last one is Transitional Justice Lab, which maybe should go first in many ways because we all want transitional justice. But we're going to start today with, we're really just doing this in alphabetical order because we're academics and we can't think anything beyond that. So we're going to start with the Initiative for International Economic Integration. And I have the pleasure of introducing faculty fellow Jeff Bergstrand. He is a finance professor at the Mendoza College of Business. And he's also a concurrent professor of economics. The initiative will, over the course of, okay, so professor.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, Susan. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for coming. We're each just going to talk for about 5 to 7 minutes, just giving a brief overview and then open up for Q&A. I want to just start with one quote, and that quote is from the Kellogg Institute's strategic plan that states its goal 1, we aspire to scholarly excellence and to values-driven research. We aim to set the research agenda on issues critical to democracy and human development, to cultivate a vibrant, interdisciplinary intellectual community, and to have a significant impact on policy and practice. My initiative on international economic integration is to some extent, while the term itself, initiative, is defined, can be defined as a first step, it's actually a step in a process that has evolved over time. To give you background and partly why I'm motivated to do it, partly by what's been going on in the world economy in the last several years is a major motivation. But of course, a motivation being part of the Kellogg Institute and the Kellogg Institute now being part of the Keough School. And one of the goals, I'm not going to read that quote, but one of the goals of the Keough School in its strategic plan is to reach out and do policy. So my initiative is very much oriented towards that. Let me just discuss in the brief 5-6 minutes that I have just 4 pillars that kind of undergird this initiative. And as perhaps I'm very likely the most senior person here, I can talk about 4 pillars that span 4 decades, but I'll try to do them quite briefly. The first is work from my, really work coming out of my dissertation 40 years ago, really literally 40 years ago last year, where I decided to take on a topic that dealt with understanding bilateral international trade flows. And this is something that, despite being part of international trade, was really, really on the periphery of understanding trade patterns. Trade was a very theoretical subject. There was some empirical work. Most of the empirical work did not support our classical trade theories of comparative advantage. And I decided to go off on the edge and kind of say, look, we have an enormous amount of information about bilateral international trade flows. There was a statistical model that explained it very well in terms of economic sizes, distance, and several other factors. And so I worked on, there was one paper in 1979 by Jim Anderson at Boston College, another Catholic institution. First worked on this, and then myself in the 1980s, and wrote 3 papers that provided theoretical foundations for understanding international trade flows. Now, why this became important, this was kind of the first pillar. Why this became important is in the 1990s, leveraging off those 2 papers by Anderson and myself, a lot of economists started developing some of this and trying to better understand the linkage between international trade flows, understanding what causes these empirical and theoretical foundations, but also what they mean for welfare, what they mean for standards of living. At that same time in the 1990s, what I did was kind of work on what are factors that explain the sequencing of regional trade agreements. So now we're talking about international economic integration, not just trade flows, but trade policies, free trade agreements. Free trade agreements started just ballooning in terms of numbers starting in the early 1990s. And so the work that I did on trade flows, work on gravity equation, was kind of a methodological framework to understand the sequencing of free trade agreements, and even more importantly, the impact of these agreements, trying to measure quantitatively, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively with precision. How do these free trade agreements affect trade flows and then ultimately in welfare? In around year 2000, then all of this work, many people starting to work on this, and it became what is now known as the new quantitative trade models developed over the course of the last 20 years, kind of built on all this. In my personal space, what I started doing in the 2000s was working on policy and working with the European Commission to actually, we worked on the foundations for the first modeling of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, which does not exist, but is potentially between the 2 largest economic masses in the world, the United States and the European Union. This has been foundering, okay? But we kind of established a framework and some of the economics undergirding, and that kind of got me into the policy space about 10 years ago. Now the last pillar. The last pillar is this decade. What we've witnessed, especially with Brexit, okay, in 2016, the imminent withdrawal of the UK from the largest trade economic integration agreement in the world, the EU, is a very disturbing factor. Every economic analysis that actually is based on some of these methodologies that I talked about tells us not just that UK's economic standard of living will fall, but the magnitude of the fall with such conviction. We faced in the United States, and also 2016, the US did not join the TPP, which is likely hurting it. And so we have that and the founder of the Transatlantic Investment Partnership. What we've seen in terms of the political sphere is a growing nationalism. We've seen responses in terms of voting behavior that really says globalization has harmed a certain sector. And mainstream economists are increasingly now getting very concerned and able to measure and quantify based upon all these methodologies that have developed over the years, trying to better evaluate the distributional costs of globalization. So what this is about, and happy to elaborate in any Q&A part, What this whole initiative is trying to form a process and a framework to better get a strategic plan, starting with the United States and potentially with major trading partners, trying to develop a framework working between policymakers and academics in a network. There are many networks out there, but using the facility of the Keough School and the DC office to try to work, bring together a team of economists, policymakers, both the executive and in the congressional legislative branches, to work together to try to form a more coherent strategy for trade policy for the United States and eventually leading out to try to address some of the problems we face and the shadow that kind of overhangs globalization, which is critical for keeping the world economy going. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to mention that we will have time for questions and answers because already I have a few, but we're going to hold them to the end. So take notes and write down what you want to ask. And after we go through all of the panels, we will have a chance to do that. So thank you very much. Next, we're going to go to the Integral Human Development Lab. And we're going to let Clemens Sedmak, he's a professor of social ethics, and Father Emmanuel Katongole, professor of theology and peace studies. They will talk to us about integral human development and the lab there.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So I go for maybe 4.5 minutes.
This is a running joke of his. He loves to do this.
She is Her Excellency. That's not a joke. It would be a joke if people called me like that. That would be, humiliating.
But I always say that my parents did not name me Excellency. They did not name me Ambassador. My parents named me Susan. So.
Wow. They didn't baptize me professor. So one could ask the question, what do the Keough School and theology have in common? And one possible answer to this question is they are based on a mystery. Because the Keough School of Global Affairs is defined by integral human development as its slogan and its unique selling proposition. And it is a little worrisome that you do not get very many very clear answers when you ask around what is it, IHD, that defines our school. I was brought here to teach social ethics. That's the title, Professor of Social Ethics. And then I found myself teach integral human development, the foundational seminar. And if it wasn't for the wonderful students, it would be a hard job. We had a number of conversations about what do faculty members think about integral human development. We had some conversations, we had some interviews, and we got expressions like warm, fuzzy, vague, confusing, ambivalent, elusive. Some questions like, what does it mean on the ground? What does it add to human development? Integral human development as opposed to what? Can it be measured? I mean, do we know whether it's happening or not happening? What does it mean for the ethos of the Keough School? What does it mean for the classroom? Do you have to be Catholic to embrace the concept? Is it Western, anthropocentric? What's wrong with it? So all these questions. And as you know from philosophy, the very first step quite often to start an intellectual journey is wonder, bewilderment, doubt. And so Father Emmanuel and I decided to tackle that more systematically. And we thought that the way to do that was not a classical research project or a classical research cluster, but a research lab. And I think we called it Integral Human Development Research Lab to make sure that it's about bridging practice and scholarship, bridging disciplines, and also trying to get some answers to open-ended questions. So what we try to do in our Integral Human Development Research Lab is we work with 3 main areas of interest. The first area of interest is the conceptualization. What does it mean? Can we develop in conversation with economists, sociologists, anthropologists, the art philosophers, some theologians, a nuanced understanding of the term integral human development? What are important traditions and what role can it play in a discourse on development per se? So that's conceptualization. The second area of interest and research is ethics. What are the normative implications of integral human development? How can we do monitoring and evaluating of projects if we are committed to IHD? What are relevant normative terms of IHD, such as flourishing, and goods. And we have this one wonderful colleague who said, you know, flourishing, I'm really flourishing. I could do with a little bit less of flourishing these days. And so these are interesting questions to ask. The third area next to conceptualization and ethics is implementation. What does it mean on the ground? What's the cash value of integral human development? What are credible evidentiary standards for assessing progress in this more inclusive approach? So these are the three questions we ask. And we want to work with 5 strategic partners. The first and most important strategic partner is the Ford Program, International Development Studies and Solidarity. Father Bob Dowd, the director of this program, which is also part of the Kellogg Institute, is on our steering committee. And the Ford Program has, meanwhile, 12 years history of implementing and designing projects in the spirit of IHD. So we want to learn more about the concept, working closely with the Ford Program. We want to work with the Human Development and the Human Capabilities and Development Association, the dicastery for promoting integral human development in the Vatican. We want to work with Catholic Relief Services and the newly founded Laudato Si Institute at the University of Oxford. And the idea is to bring practitioners and scholars together and not only look at projects, but also develop projects. And that's the point where I hand over to my esteemed colleague, role model, and mentor, Father Emmanuel.
Well, thank you very much. And one of the programs that we want to connect to and work with is a very particular initiative in Uganda called the Bethany Land Institute. It is an organization, an initiative I started together with 2 priest colleagues in Uganda in 2005 as a response to the pressing challenges of food insecurity, of deforestation and ecological degradation, especially in rural communities, but also the question of poverty, especially in the rural areas in Uganda, in Africa broadly. What we tried to do within that institute, in a way, it was very coincidental that around the time that we were wondering about those programs, those challenges, Pope Francis published the encyclical Laudato Si, in which he made a very compelling connection between the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. That to respond to any of those cries, you have to do it in an integral way. And so he kind of provides that notion of integral ecology, initiatives that not only fight poverty, respect creation, but also advance human dignity. And so we wanted to do that. And so this initiative is about doing that with young people in the rural communities through a program of sustainable agriculture, creation care, reforestation, and economic empowerment. So we were going to connect this research lab to an initiative concretely on the ground in Africa, in Uganda, called the Bethany Land Institute. But why does research in integral human development require or need an initiative like this, very concrete initiative? I think 3 reasons why an initiative like this is needed in terms of research on integral human development. First of all, we are convinced that there are some things about integral human development that cannot be learned, cannot be known, except in the very practice of integral ecology, except in the very doing of integral ecology. So kind of connecting really to practice in a very, very intrinsic way. Secondly, we are convinced that in terms of testing or trying to find out implementation, how does this look like? What are the ways in which, for example, the notion of human dignity can be described, can be seen to be advanced by whatever practice that one is doing? One requires, in a way, to kind of follow over a certain period of time initiatives like this. So kind of really providing us with a ground for testing out, for observing, and for describing the dynamics of integral human development in a very concrete way. And thirdly, to connect with research and teaching. So one of the initiatives we're doing in connection with the integral human development are courses that are developed within this framework. And to begin with, next spring in 2020, Clemens and I are teaching a course on peace, ecology, and integral human development here at Notre Dame. And over the spring break, bring the students over to the Bethany Institute and spend a week working with the young people on the ground, at the same time learning with them in the issues of ecology and integral human development. So that's why we are very, very much excited about this lab, the Integral Human Development Research Lab.
Thank you very much, Father. Thank you, Clemens. So we now have to amend that to be the Integral Human Development Research Lab. So thank you very much for that correction. So now we're going to turn to reparations and compliance. And the Reparations and Compliance Lab is led by two of our faculty fellows, Diane Desierto, who is an associate professor of human rights law and global affairs at the Keough School, as well as Aníbal Pérez-Liñán, who is a professor of political science and global affairs. So I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you, Susan. Actually, we also have to amend the name because the official longhand version is the Notre Dame Reparations Design and Compliance Lab, because they're interrelated dimensions to what we seek to do, particularly from this interdisciplinary endeavor from the law as well as from political science. From my standpoint, what's the fundamental quandary in the international legal system, particularly in the international human rights system? While we may have a proliferation of courts and tribunals that can adjudicate and basically determine whether or not states have violated human rights, unfortunately, the most undeveloped area of the law is the reparative function that's adjudicated by these particular courts and tribunals. To date, if the usual range in assigning state responsibility, once a state has been found to be internationally responsible for a human rights violation, the choice of the reparative mechanism is usually just one of three. It's either to restitute, to return whatever was taken, to compensate, or to issue an apology. And this was largely, by and large, because the international legal community was not aware of the particular nuances of trying to do reparations in a very totalizing manner. We see this from the standpoint of the law as a major gap. There has been nothing, at least since the early 2000s, that has tried to advance thinking in this regard, particularly not just the typology of reparations, but how to get states to comply with them. This is why our lab is about design and compliance, because we see the two as intimately related. So from our standpoint, the ultimate question would be, and this is why I was so happy to work with Aníbal, having learned what he was doing as well separately, and only at the Keough School can you find this kind of collaboration. My standpoint is, how do we design a reparative mechanism for a full range of human rights violations that are increasingly gaining in complexity? We talk today about climate change, we talk about displacements and forced migrations, we talk about mass atrocities, and yet there's a proliferation of tribunals around the world that still follow the same typology by virtue of the idea that the only possibilities for law is just to either return, compensate, or to apologize for international wrongs. Nothing has been attempted from this standpoint to look at the very victims of human rights themselves, to what essentially can bring them to closest to the idea of what repairs them, or at least makes them whole, which is the standard that we're supposed to aspire for in international law. So to this day, we have a yawning gap, whether it's historical injustices such as slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, mass atrocities where even in the recent case decided by the International Criminal Court, particular international crimes, including genocide and child soldiering, was met with a symbolic compensation of $250. Contrast that with today, an international system where investors can claim against states to the tune of $50 billion. There's a vast asymmetry, and nobody has really brought decided thinking to how to do reparations for disputes that involve human rights impacts and have human rights stakeholders. And so I was very glad to see that Aníbal had his path-breaking model to try and get us to determine what the conditions of compliance are. So I'll turn to you.
So the goals that Diane is articulating in terms of research boil down to a fundamental question, which is how can we design reparation measures that we can guarantee that states are going to comply with, that they are going to be honored. And so we have been working developing statistical models to predict compliance with decisions of international courts, such that we can estimate the probability that governments will comply in any particular year. We can estimate the expected time to compliance. And also we can predict what is the window of opportunity, which is the period in which compliance is most likely, so that international courts can understand when is the moment in which they can exercise maximum leverage to secure compliance with some of their orders. What is exciting for us in many ways is that this is a project that in which we can see the immediate impact and usefulness of what we are doing. We are already in conversations with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, even before formally starting with the lab. We have prepared 2 reports for the Inter-American Court, and we hope that we will produce a report every year. And it's the type of project that it allows us to integrate students in multiple ways. So we have already worked with about 11 undergraduate students at Notre Dame, 3 graduate students in law and in political science. And it's something that generates a lot of interest and a lot of potential. We are even talking with the Inter-American Court about the possibility of creating some type of internship for undergrads or recent graduates. So it's something that it's very exciting for us in that regard.
And there's a teaching and a research component and an outreach component to the lab. But also, at least apart from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, we're also looking at the decisions of the World Bank inspection panels, which has been able to find particular breaches of environmental standards or social standards, but has not been able to completely recommend or design the kind of reparative mechanism for these particular breaches that occur in the cross-border development project setting. So to the extent that Aníbal's model really speaks to this issue of how to design and when appropriately we can identify conditions that states will comply and how tribunals can maximize that particular opportunity to get them to comply. I'm very excited about this prospect. It doesn't exist yet in international law. We have a real chance to try and contribute here.
That's great. I think actually just talking about reparations and models like that leads us really nicely, even though we did it in alphabetical order, to our last research lab, which probably also has a change in name that I've not been told about. Transitional Justice and something lab? Just Transitional Justice Lab. The one time I try to make an exception, it's exactly as it should be. So we will hear from Professor Guillermo Trejo, who is an associate professor of political science, and he is a faculty fellow leading this lab.
Thank you, Susan. So when countries experience or undergo periods of mass atrocities, and when governments are incapable of addressing, responding, and providing justice to the victims, we typically speak about the need for extraordinary mechanisms of justice. And that's the world of transitional justice. We're talking about countries with hundreds of thousands or millions of victims of human rights violations, countries that have impunity rates of 98%, 99%. Those are countries in which mechanisms of extraordinary justice or transitional justice are usually adopted. For the most part, when we think about transitional justice, we speak about an ecosystem of different measures that include truth commissions or human rights trials, programs of reparations, and programs of institutional reforms to prevent repetition. And for the most part, the transitional justice literature has looked into cases of civil wars or cases of dictatorship. And we associate transitional justice with this type of political violence. Now, part of the problem is that a lot of the violence that is taking place in the world, and particularly in Latin America, is not happening, at least technically, in countries that are considered to be dictatorships, but democracies. And it's happening in countries that are not technically considered to be experiencing civil war, but these are countries at peace. Post-transition Latin America and post-civil war Latin America produces these days probably as much or more violence than we ever experienced under civil war or dictatorship. And nonetheless, we're not prepared to clearly understand, conceptualize, name what these phenomena are, let alone to adopt the appropriate measures to address these new forms of violence and victimization. So building on research that we've conducted here over the past 7 years with former graduate students, current graduate students, in which we're trying to rethink dynamics of criminal violence. This is certainly not considered to be an instance of political violence, but it's very hard for anyone studying these realities in Latin America to simply make distinctions of state and non-state actors in which criminals are non-state actors. It's become very clear that for the most part, cartels, criminal organizations are the result of the interaction between state security forces and criminal groups. It's very difficult to understand organized criminal groups as non-state actors. These are actors in which security forces are deeply embedded, colluded, and are part of the problem. Based on research that we've conducted that shows that, say, countries that adopted transitional justice mechanisms at the time of transitioning to democracy tend to experience lower levels of violence. That's Argentina, that's Chile, that's surprisingly Peru. Countries that transition to democracy but do not adopt this type of transitional justice mechanisms are the most violent and lethal countries. Honduras, Mexico, Brazil. So what does the lab do? The lab has 3 components. One that is a research component, a second component that is a policy and practice component, and a third component, which is an evaluation component. The research, the Transitional Justice Lab is trying to build a two-way highway that connects the research with human rights practitioners with victims. And we speak of a two-way highway because it's not just research that illuminates what practitioners and what victims do, but it goes the other way around. It goes from what victims need and require to what practitioners suggest to the type of research that we will be responding. So to a great extent, a key concept in what we do is a concept of accompaniment. We are developing a research instrument that will accompany human rights organizations and victims in their quest for truth and justice and for reparations and for institutional reforms to avoid from Let me just give you a few examples of the type of work that we will be doing, that we've been conducting already, thanks to help from Kellogg in preparing this group into launching this lab. We're operating in different countries, specifically in Mexico. We're functioning already as if we were a truth commission. So the couple of things that we're doing with a wonderful team of graduate students and undergraduate students here at Notre Dame, we're doing an inventory in Mexico of all forms of violence and victimization that have taken place in the past 12 years as a result of the war on drugs. But we are trying to go beyond the data that most people collect on homicides attributed to organized crime or forced displacement or missing people or cases of femicides. We're also looking into building new data sets. You'll be quite surprised that in many countries in Latin America, I would specifically say countries like Mexico or Colombia, the number of priests that get assassinated. If you take southern Mexico, the state of Guerrero, one diocese has a Catholic diocese has become the most dangerous diocese for Catholic personnel in the Western Hemisphere. But at the same time, that diocese has that area is a focal point for the assassination of mayors, political party leaders, for journalists, for human rights defenders, for business people, for notary publics, and you name it. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to collect data that a few people are collecting, NGOs are collecting, trying to launch a project that is called Ecosystems of Local Violence, to try to understand also with the help of data analysis and data science, when a priest sadly or tragically becomes assassinated, what's the probability that the next person to go down would be a human rights defender or a social movement leader or a politician or a business leader? And what is the probability when all that happens in this ecosystem of local violence? What's the probability of the area experiencing a massacre or a case of mass displacement? So we're developing a unit of data analysis and using tools of data science. Some of our graduate students are currently taking classes in machine learning to try to develop predictive models to understand when this type of violence happens. The lab on the research side, we're trying in seeking to answer questions of who did what to whom, why and how. We're trying to develop models that help us explain, but also we're moving into prediction, which is key to prevent this type of atrocities from happening. Now, let me just give you an example of the type of policy practice that we're doing. Let me just give you an example also in the case of Mexico. We're operating, or we're hoping to operate initially Mexico, Guatemala, moving quickly to El Salvador, possibly to Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. But initially in the first phase, mostly the work that we're doing is with partners that we've developed on the ground. Lots of Notre Dame LLMs we're working in Mexico and Guatemala. And we've developed lots of partnerships with human rights NGOs, and we've been working with many collectivos of victims. Let me just give you very quickly a second example of the policy and practice. We're seeking into developing a project of a truth-seeking process. When you think about massacres in Latin America, we typically think about tragic events, El Mozote in El Salvador, or Ayacucho in Peru, or different focal points of violence. There's one municipality in southern Mexico, in the southern state of Guerrero, that in the 1970s in Mexico during the Dirty War, there were approximately, depending on the number, 1,500 to 2,000 cases of forced disappearance. In this single municipality, close to 30 to 40% of the forced disappearance happened. And we're hoping to work with 200 families from that area to try to engage into a truth-seeking process of what happened in the 1970s. That same area where this violence happened 40 to 50 years ago, today is the single most dangerous area for the Catholic Church, for politicians, social movement leaders, so on and so forth. So we're trying to understand the chain, the sequence. Why is it that past political violence is so intimately related to the criminal violence of the present? And we're trying to develop based on the best social science research, try to understand the context in which this happened, try to work with the families. In questions of reparations, some of our international human rights lawyers from Notre Dame who are assisting these families. They're trying to enter into a program of reparations, negotiating with the Mexican government. Mexican authorities ask them, say, you know, we're willing to write a check for these families. What's the number? When these human rights lawyers went back to the families said, well, it's very difficult to estimate a number. It's been 50 years. So what we're trying to do with the lab is using techniques that some of our graduate students are using quite extensively and quite successfully, models of counterfactual analysis, synthetic control methods, to try to understand what would have been the life and in terms of human development of these communities had they not experienced levels of mass atrocities that they did in the 1970s. So what would be the levels of investment in education, in health, land redistribution? What would be the life like of the children and the grandchildren of these people had there not been this episode of mass atrocity? Using these type of methods and contextual analysis, I think we would be equipped and prepared to actually assist the human rights lawyers that are working on the ground to get back to the Mexican government and say, you don't need to write a check, but you need to develop something like a mini Marshall Plan for these communities to overcome the impunity of the past 50 years. Finally, in terms of evaluation, what we're doing, let me just give you the example of Guatemala, again, working with our graduate students. Guatemala is a very violent society, experienced a 36-year civil war. We know that there's lots of gang violence, lots of drug trafficking violence of different types. Guatemala had 2 truth commissions, and nonetheless was extremely violent. But starting 2008, Guatemala has become a success story. We don't see Guatemala as a success story in the US or in the rest of Latin America. Together with the United Nations, Guatemala adopted a very specific mechanism of justice that was called the International Commission Against Impunity, or CICIG. If you take Guatemala in the year 2008, the homicide rate was approximately 44 per 100,000 population, one of the most violent countries in the world. A decade later, Guatemala is around 22 per 100,000. Mexico is at 30, Brazil is at 30, Honduras is at 60, El Salvador is at 60 or has reached 105. So it's really a remarkable, one of the most remarkable stories associated with this partnership between the United Nations and the Public Prosecutor's Office in Guatemala, the office, the local police, and different local institutions. What we're trying to do in the lab, and with this I end, is we've conducted this evaluation of the work of CICIG. CICIG, the work of CICIG, as you know, CICIG was expelled from Guatemala fairly recently. And it's very sad because this is probably one of the most successful stories of reducing crime that we have in Latin America. What we're trying to do is really assess how this happened, how this major reduction happened. We spent a couple of weeks in Guatemala speaking to all actors, trying to understand how high-risk tribunals work, how cases, how the investigation takes place. Just to give you just one example, the most lethal cartel in Mexico, the Zetas, tried to penetrate Guatemala in 2007, 2008. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people killed in Mexico can be attributed to the war that the Mexican government declared against the Zetas. So the way the Mexican government dealt with the Zetas was by deploying the army and declaring an upfront war against them. We know that the result was a bloodshed. What did the Guatemalans do when the Zetas were trying to penetrate?
Guillermo.
Well, the CICIG, I'll finish the story. The CICIG, together with local actors, what they used was intelligence. And what they did is an exemplary case of prosecution that dismantled the Zetas and eliminated the Zetas from Guatemala. That's the type of evaluation we want to produce in the lab and learn from those experiences to help other countries like Mexico, Colombia, El Salvador.
Thank you. So let's give everyone a round of applause. So I have a couple of notes to mention. Clemens has a class that he has to teach, so he will be leaving. So don't assume that he is disgruntled with his panelists.
Which could be the case nonetheless, right?
His words, not mine. So I'm going to just try to gather a few of the themes that I listened to. So some of the themes that I hear from the 4 labs, very much a harmonization of accompaniment, human dignity, trying to emphasize that is really the focus of both the Kellogg Institute and the Keough School. Globalization, all of the new, the issues that we're struggling with today, global trade, the limits of it, globalization in general, this push-pull. Some people want it, some people don't. Is it beneficial? Is it not? Just last week, we formalized the process of, the US just formalized the process of disengaging from the Paris climate change. agreement. Now, luckily, some states have decided that while as a global United States, the United States is not going to be part of it, but the states want to stay committed to that. We're looking at Brexit. What does that mean? What does it mean for the borders? And what does it mean for people transiting the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland? We don't want to make a signatory peace agreement that ended massive bloodshed and for so many years. We don't want to call that back into question. What do we do? Can some of the research that we're finding, whether it's from Global Trade, whether it's Integral Human Development and Research Lab, whether it's reparations, how do we deal with the climate change actions that are happening around the world due to desertification, erosion, it's everywhere. And what do we do to restore people who have been hurt and harmed by human rights violations, mass atrocities, mass violence that is taking forms these days in ways that we hadn't seen previously? So I'm just going to ask the first question before we open it up to the floor. And I'd like to know whether when we talk about reparations, I like the fact that we're talking very much about a cross-curricular approach. I mean, Diane and I are both lawyers, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, no one else is a lawyer on the panel. Is that correct? So this being able to work across the lines and across political science, economics, I find that really exciting and interesting. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to be here at the Keough School, because you don't find that very often. We're still siloed, we're not perfect, but the fact that we're at least trying to branch out of that. So here's my question. We just put on a panel in the Washington office of the Keough School on South Sudan. A lot of these same issues, for all the way from trade to mass violence, atrocities, human rights violations, etc. War, which is continuing right now. The PAM project, the Peace Accords Matrix, which is Kroc Institute, has a program looking at peace accords. They are looking at about 36 or so right now. 18 of them are in Africa. A lot of the others are in the rest of the world, so spread out across Asia and Latin America primarily. Is there a way that between reparations and restorative justice, transitional justice, could you work with the people in the mediation teams to put into place the mechanisms up front into the peace deal? And how would you go about that?
That's a huge question, but I will try to answer it. The yawning gap we have right now when it comes to reparations is that current initiatives are either through legislation or through treaties, which is good from a political mobilization standpoint because you can indeed try to contextually develop reparations programs. But the yawning gap in the international legal system is precisely the proliferation of courts, whether it's the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the many tribunals, regional human rights tribunals that have a limited mandate, that have a limited institutional jurisdictional function, and yet find themselves restrained by the current conventional law that says when it's reparations, we do look at just this limited topology of reparations. Now, lawyers have tried in drawing from efforts with respect to treaty negotiations and particularly insights from legislated attempts to gain reparations for historical injustices. Lawyers have tried to make these arguments before the courts, but they haven't always succeeded. And this is partly an institutional problem because courts exist only because states create them and states give them resources, which is why Aníbal's model is so apt here, because we do have to think about what the states want to commit to, and under what conditions really are they committed to follow through with an adjudicated decision that says X entity or group of persons who have been victims of serious human rights violations are entitled to this kind of reparative program. But without that understanding of why states will comply, it's very hard to get an institution to say, okay, I'll come up with some reparative program out of nowhere and think that this is the most appropriate way to do it. They'll be accused of overreach. There will be an attempt to try and nullify whatever decision has been issued, simply because there will be an accusation that they're overreaching institutionally and according to the terms of consent of states. Which is why, while I'm all for drawing upon the literature on peace accords, on contextualized data gathering with respect to victim narratives, we also have to meet that halfway with where and under what conditions do states really comply? Because this is the yawning gap. Today, for example, in the International Court of Justice this year, for the first time in the case of DRC versus Rwanda, the court, when it adjudicated all those human rights violations about 15 years ago, told the parties just negotiate on reparations. It never even bothered to monitor whether or not there was a negotiation. 15 years later, DRC comes to the ICJ and says, we need an actual reparations judgment, because nothing in all the breaches that you've adjudicated has actually materialized by way of any form of reparative mechanism. And again, that's because of restraint.
Right, so is there a way that we can, this is great from a scholarly perspective, but as a practitioner, how can we make sure that someone who's been doing the research in your labs, it could be any of the labs, is actually then sitting down while they are negotiating whatever settlement to the end of conflict X, that the predictive model gets included, the accountability models are included, and then how do we make sure that it has some effect across the borders? Because a lot of these crises are not only within, whether it's Guatemala, Chile, South Sudan, they're across borders, or they have a cross-border effect. Is there a way that we can pull that out and make sure that we have people who are not just in the lab, but who are now empowered to be on the ground, so that we have someone that's working with these various mediators that are mediating agreements? How can we do that? Do you have, any thoughts? Sometimes the lawyers don't always have the greatest thoughts, so we have to turn it to the other side.
I'll put it in the context in terms of going back to and tying some of your earlier comments about peace and cross-border issues. I mean, I think one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century was the European Economic Community in terms of bringing an end to centuries of war between France and Germany, and a material treaty that kind of basically ensured that we would put very low probability on it happening again. It's interesting to know in terms of thinking about cross-disciplinary aspects, which you mentioned earlier in your comments. We had a conference here about 10 years ago on regionalism, where we had a very prominent economist from Europe say that basically the motivation for the EEC was a political one to alleviate war, whereas we had a prominent political scientist say, no, it was kind of the economic gains that was going to be behind it.
But can't we let both sides win?
Yeah. One thing I also kind of listening to some of the comments is just an interesting thing about the economics of it. We talk about, say, bilateral free trade agreements. There's some, I mean, I elaborated in my comments in terms of we're able to more and more with precision, consistency, prediction, be able to understand quantitatively how free trade agreements, other types of economic integration agreements affect trade flows and ultimately affect welfare. But there's also an interesting thing, work done by a couple of authors that have looked at these free trade agreements and how they affect both international conflicts as well as international. And this is an interesting thing. When what they found, and they actually did, the East African community was the study for this. And they found that by going into the AC, that actually reduced the probability of a war between the member nations, but it actually increased, because of diversion of activity, it increased international conflict. No different than when we talk about NAFTA. This is one of my primary interests right now, and motivations. I didn't mention it in my comments, but it was the threat of leaving NAFTA that is extraordinarily serious. Talking about interactions and mediation, the very first step in the new USMCA, which was about a year ago, was to have, it goes before the USITC, and they have testimony, okay? So we have dialogues between lobbyists in Congress, the government authorities for the ITC, which is a independent organization, to kind of hash out the benefits and costs of NAFTA versus USMCA, and I had the ability to be part of that testimony. Just the threat of that is immense. And some of the estimates are basically, and I did some research on this, and this is undergirding some of this, that the elimination of NAFTA, which is still a possibility, it would obviously reduce international trade dramatically between countries, have enormous impact on the automotive sector, have enormous impact upon this part of the country, but would also cause an increase in international trade, such that countries like Canada, which is very dispersed geographically and economically, is actually hurt the worst. So these are just kind of some related things.
I'm going to give the last word before we open it up to Clemens, because he's also got to go and teach, but also I think you have an important comment to contribute.
Thank you. No, it's not an important comment. I have two small remarks. One is, if I understood your question correctly, it's about how can we get close to people and not have this stay within the lab. And I thought that's the point of the lab as I see it, and thanks to the Kellogg Institute that you support that. In our case, we try to work with a concrete initiative on the ground and with strategic partners like the Ford program and then CRS that work with real people on the ground to get this kind of knowledge by acquaintance that you need to be credible in your findings, as well as a conversation partner around the table. So I think that's one remark. And the other is, I was intrigued listening to reparations and transitional justice. And of course, great Jeff too, I couldn't follow, but it was great. Because the thought I had was, there are these rigorous research methods, but you deal with fragile, vulnerable, delicate matters and populations. And I find it's really impressive that you can have rigorous research and something which is almost a research spirituality. Because ethics gets you so far, but you need this deep respect and deep concern and deep care where you have the sensitivity that you cannot learn from a book from ethics. And I think that's very consoling for me. Also from an IHD perspective, rigorous methods being reconcilable with this sense of, well, I call it a research spirituality. Thank you, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Clemens.
Follow up on that?
Yeah.
So I think one of the key points here is the idea of partnership too, because at least in the world of transitional justice, the most successful cases are those in which there's a big mobilization from below and from outside. Governments in general don't like to be held accountable, specifically on questions of
children either.
Violations. No one in a position of authority likes accountability. So to a great extent, there has to be some pressure from below or from outside. You look at the most successful cases in Latin America are those in which civil society at all levels really comes together. And here, I'm not talking about the usual suspects of human rights NGOs and victims and their families, but I'm talking about churches. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the business community. When the business community—
Organized groups.
Well, and in general, when the business community actually acknowledges that human rights, and I'm gonna say something that might be a little outrageous, but that human rights is good for business, that there's no way to succeed in international markets without having a rule of law, and that the rule of law is not just defining property rights, but respecting human rights and people's dignity. So countries that have turned around their own situation, a situation of mass atrocities, is when all actors, when unions and business and churches and human rights organizations and victims and others, victims and non-victims, come together in this understanding that this is crucial in terms of development, integral human development. And that requires lots of partnerships. And these labs need to develop those partnerships, translate the type of knowledge that we have in a way that is relevant for the business community, that is relevant for churches, that is, we need to have the power of persuasion, and our only tool to be persuasive is to develop top-notch research.
Well,
that is not just necessarily technocratic, but that puts people and victims at the center, and that we're mindful of how that social science might be put to the service of them.
Right, and I would just add, before we open it up, I would just add that that's important, but oftentimes we have the research, we have the results, the data, but how do we get it to people to actually utilize, and when they're afraid to go out and lobby for their rights or protest against bad actions taking place. So let me now open it up to the floor, and we have Lupe who has the microphone, so please raise your hands. And I'd encourage especially our advisory board to ask any questions about the labs. Did we bore everyone that much? Great, okay, excellent.
Hi, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I'm concerned a bit about the loss of credibility that institutions are suffering at this point. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I struggled so much while I was listening to you, thinking this is great. You know, that people care about this. But so many people have lost faith in the institutions you're talking about, including universities, church, governments, you know, easily have lost huge human rights organizations, have lost anything that seems to be organized, seems to have been, faith has been lost. And I think it was Scott and I talking at lunch today about, you know, there's almost an anarchical feel right now. So how do you, I'm not getting too pessimistic. I had a bad interchange with my son, and I think that pissed me off. You know, I'm just wondering, like, how do you deal with that? So you're talking about marginalized communities and helping them. I see that, you know, the NBA is co-opted by the Chinese, you know, by the repressive Chinese government. I see, you know, I see that the church is constantly being criticized for anything it does. You know, there just seems to be this general loss of respect for authority and for the little guy. And how do you guys propose that might change how you act on the ground? If that makes any sense, I congratulate you for that.
Let me let Father Emmanuel take a first stab at it.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much for. I don't think we have a right to be pessimistic, to lose hope. Otherwise, I think whatever we do is self-defeating. That is one. The other comment that I have, just in terms of, for example, our understanding of the integral human development, my own research, is a sense that, you know, there are always surprising elements, even in unexpected places, at the margins, for example, in non-institutional ways. That is why I think also connection to the grassroots matters, so that it's not just an institutional framework that one has in terms of research. One of the things that I've discovered through my research on grassroots communities and actors, a number of surprising initiatives that perhaps are not connected to any major institution. Some of that might arise out of institutional connections, but the initiatives themselves go beyond whether it is state or government or this particular business. And they kind of, in a way, radiate or indicate new possibilities. For me, this is where this kind of research is also surprising in many ways, in that I'm hoping to discover new, uncharted, unplotted initiatives in a way. And what do we learn, we who are standing within institutional frameworks, whether it is within the church or within this kind of research or within this kind of university? So I'm doing kind of my research with kind of open-ended ways also in a way. And one of the things that we want to do in terms of the integral human development is not kind of to think that, okay, this idea of HID is kind of framed like this, is a concept, a theory, and therefore just kind of say, okay, how do we apply it, or where is it applied, so that you can test it or measure it, but also kind of to observe, learning to observe in a way places that individuals, and doing that over a long time, learning to discover that there is a lot that is going on. So that saves me from the kind of pessimism that I think you're talking about, whether it is institutional and so forth. There's a lot that is going on. And how can some of these initiatives never be radiated, be narrated, be told, be evidenced in such a way that perhaps we can build onto that? I think we are in a process or in a context and a time where new things are emerging, new principles, new forms of political organization are emerging beyond what we know right now to be the norm.
Jeff?
Yeah. So I think in terms of, for what I work on, globalization, okay, is in some sense an institution. We think about it more narrowly. We can think about the institution, the World Trade Organization, okay? And, I talked a lot about economic integration agreements. Just the first thing is, in terms of globalization, we talk about this frustration with individual. I mean, there's been a backlash, clear backlash. Globalization has taken, often xenophobia crops up when people aren't getting their fair share. Very important thing to notice, or to keep in mind, is that globalization gets a big backlash, not so much technological change, even though both tend to be skill bias. That is, globalization tends to help the more educated relative to the less educated. Also, technology tends to be embraced more by the educated versus the uneducated. Very hard to separate those. So as trade economists, we strive to try to better understand, but it's difficult quantitatively to isolate that. But that said, with trade economists, we've pushed all along with our models and that the welfare gains, and and we're proud of having to get, we're a social science. We're proud to get quantitative estimates that we rigorously test about those gains from trade. But we often talk about, economists talk about in terms of the average and not about the distribution. And we know, going back, there's a theorem, a Heck-Schilling theorem is exactly 100 years old, from 1919. And one of those, that with comparative advantage in international trade, countries on average can be better off. There are gainers and there are losers. You can always compensate the losers and the gainers still be better off, but we've not done that. That's the thing. And that's a justifiable backlash against this institution of globalization and the institutions behind that. That said, in terms of optimism, if we think back, there was you remember like in Seattle, there was a big backlash against the WTO, right? And that kind of thing. And the WTO, it exists. It's a very important institutional framework, but it's not the all-encompassing framework that solves all of our problems. And we've realized its limits. And the last substantive thing to come out of the WTO, the last round, closed in 1994. The Doha round, nobody now even talks about the Doha round. But what's happened? What's happened is we responded because of our creativity as a society with a path towards regionalism, right? We use the market. I often look at regionalism in the path and how I model it as it's a marketplace that's trying to sort out, you know, what is on net benefit. So I'm optimistic in that sense. We've now had this backlash. So for me, the question is working with policymakers, bringing academics together, our latest knowledge that we have trust in or confidence in, bring that together with policymakers, find out who's hurt. Looking at a very fascinating thing in the last couple of years is looking at granular data of commuting zones. Okay, there's 435 districts in like the U.S. Congress, right? Representatives. There's over 700 commuter zones. Okay, where we study the economic impact of trade on these commuter zones, on employment, on wages, and trying to sort out so we get a better feel for who needs to be helped, who's hurt, and bring all sides together to try to address that in hopefully a positive atmosphere.
I know the other panelists want to answer, but I'd like to move on if that's okay. Okay.
It's a question for, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It's a question that applies to, can you hear me? Oh, that applies to everyone.
Could you maybe say who you are? We didn't get that.
Hi, I'm Maggie Guzman. I graduated from here 3 years ago and was very involved with Kellogg. But how has this design of these research labs changed the way that you do research? Or has it changed the way that you do research? In other words, what would you say is the value add of this new design, this new scheme for conducting research and policy?
Let's turn Diane for, Aníbal, go ahead.
I think that's a fundamental question, because what I hear in common across all the labs is that we are dealing with questions that in some way come to us as opposed to questions that we formulate. We have tools, we have research instruments, we have resources to answer questions. And as academics, that's what we do, right? We answer questions. But in most cases, it's questions that we pose ourselves, right? And that's a very comfortable universe. What the labs have in common, I think, is that either from activists in Mexico or from members of international courts and the representatives of the victims, or policymakers or development organizations, they are formulating questions that now we need to address. So these are questions that come to us, and we are putting our resources to the service of answering them. And that's a less comfortable situation than we usually face. But I think it's going to be much more productive.
Anyone want to add?
I think what adds to it is also a sense of urgency, particularly with the lab. When we decided that we would do this, it's precisely because this is the time that for institutions, whether they're the proper cities for faith, for me is, I don't actually think they're the proper cities for faith. Institutions are there for action. They're tools for human decision-making. So I don't look at it as a matter of do we have faith in institutions so much as do we have faith in our ability to use institutions to realize the aims of justice, to realize the aims of human rights. There's urgency because there is so much disenchantment with international criminal courts, with international human rights mechanisms, because we're so good at identifying breaches. We're not as good in identifying how to repair. And courts are supposed to do that. They're supposed to be educated, and they're supposed to at least, and they're posing these questions now. The ICJ is asking councils, how do we do this in the case of economic, social, cultural rights violation? How do you protect the right to education, say in a case like Qatar versus UAE? Nobody in the field has ever done that, which is why for us, we're on a very strict timeline to produce the results, to produce the best practices recommendations, to gather our colleagues from different international criminal courts and different international human rights courts, but also the councils themselves who go to these courts and have to put forward the claims for reparations that can have a reasonable guarantee of success because there will be compliance. To this date, it's been done for everything in the economic law space. It has not been done for human rights. So for us, it's urgency more than anything else.
Guillermo?
So in the transitional justice world, one of the mantras is that victims should be at the center. And something that we experienced working in the lab this summer with the PhD students and the undergrads, we would be constantly asking the question, what would the victims think? How is this useful for the victims? something that we typically don't challenge ourselves to do when you are simply thinking about what is reviewer 2 going to think, or what is Cambridge University Press going to think, which is relevant, what the APSR would think, and what the editors would think, or what the reviewers would think. But here, certainly we had the victims in mind at all times. So that's one fundamental change. The second one, and to connect with the previous question about legitimacy, I think we do live in a world in which there's a huge credibility issue, but that also affects academia. And this is there's a concept that we've been discussing here at Keough and others, the concept of extractivism. That more and more we're looked at people who go on the ground, become friendly with communities to do a little experiment, get back with the data, publish in the top economic journal, get tenure, never devolve, never go back. And something that we've been discussing quite extensively, not just the idea of devolving, but one notch ahead, which is a company. And how can you do it without compromising the integrity, the core integrity of the social scientific research? And I think that's a great challenge, because when you put the victim at the center, it's not that you want to reproduce and use tools of science to say what they want to say, which is quite interesting. When you really engage with victims, this accompaniment, they say, don't forget that you are an expert in such and such. And I reach out to your accompaniment, not because you're a nice buddy or because I like you, but partly because you're an expert. And we want that expertise to accompany us. Now, the last point would be when you go back, you do it once, the lab did something, we got, a little press, the president of the university is happy, Kellogg is happy, we're all happy, I got a promotion, 20%, and I never go back. Now, I went back now, and communities say, oh, you're back. And this is the third time you're back, despite the danger of this area. So building that credibility is of the essence for what we do there. When communities actually say, you are back. And when we're actually pursuing, yeah, this is a long-term shot. I'm here for the long run. And that's absolutely crucial.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you. That was very, very interesting. We were discussing earlier today with Guillermo that basically most or all of the things we talked about today, free trade, reparations, transitional justice, you have to get those things through governments. How do you do it? I mean, is there any research or is there any serious studies on how to persuade the government to do all these things? And that actually would apply for many of the things done by the Kellogg or the Keough. I mean, those things have to get applied, and you have to get it sometimes in spite of governments and not thanks to governments. Is there any research around it, or what can we, how can we go about it and make this apply easier?
Diane, I saw you nodding.
It's so crucial for us in our lab to do the outreach simultaneously as we're using the model, looking at and illuminating what the possible design and best practices for reparations are. This is because for the international courts, because they're constituted by states, they come up for regular review for budgetary purposes. The International Court of Justice President, President Yusuf, came up before the UN General Assembly, pointing out to the crisis with respect to the International Court of Justice's resources. The first question that he got from the General Assembly was, but what are you doing when states don't comply? So this kind of research that we hope to produce, we hope to be able to give it directly to those exact constituencies that need to appeal to states.
But isn't their response going to be, but we don't have a police arm, so of course we can't enforce a judgment. We are not a state like other states that can say, all right, well, my justice branch is going to go after those people who have not complied. They're a court without that mechanism.
Yeah. and our brilliant ambassador, of course, captured the question exactly. I make a distinction between enforcement and compliance, as I've written in previous work and published in previous work. Enforcement, you can pretty much leave the victorious party to their own resources with respect to trying to get the outcome from a decision. So in arbitration, enforcement ends up being facilitated through treaty. In other mechanisms, when parties prevail, they can use that decision, either take it to a national body or tribunal. Compliance is more difficult because it doesn't just depend on the legal decision. It doesn't just depend on the adjudication. It depends on a whole host of factors. This is why Aníbal's model is particularly insightful. I think he can speak to it more, because if you differentiate as to the kinds of orders that states in Latin America had to take on as part of human rights reparations, there is a huge window between the famous 7 years and 76 years between what kinds of reparative orders get addressed first, as opposed to those that get addressed last. So to
I'm
that
waiting
extent,
for my 40 acres and a mule.
and believe me, my goal is ultimately at some point to get to this entire question of why in adjudication, and there's an upcoming case, CARICOM wants to put forward a case involving transatlantic slave trade. So to this extent, our research, we hope, becomes immediately relevant for the decision makers, particularly states, who have to decide how much resources to commit and what to design, and under what circumstances do they expect that this will materialize? Nobody's done this from our space.
But it's also important, I think state matters, and state is all important. It's also important to kind of begin to think also outside this state imagination, that everything has to happen through the state, has to be channeled through the state, is the state. I think we need also to free our minds in terms of thinking about approaches, whether it's transitional justice mechanism or legal systems, or in our case, integral human development, that happens not necessarily always through the state, but in other places, other platforms, and other avenues where, for example, integral human development is being engaged, is happening. And see how that kind of maybe at times, yes, is complementary to the state, at times it's even opposition of the state, and provides new ways in terms of thinking about these kind of concepts. I don't want us to always kind of limit ourselves to this kind of statist imagination. That I think would impoverish not only our own research, but also the possibilities of what we can see happening out there on the ground.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Aníbal.
I think one of the fundamental issues is that we tend to see the state as a unity, and that fiction is particularly important for international law. But the state really is multiple moving pieces. So sometimes political will for compliance or for transitional justice is only in the executive branch, but sometimes it's in the judiciary, sometimes it's in the legislature or the bureaucracy. And the role of civil society in activating those coalitions is fundamental. So I think we need to, one of the crucial lessons is to think about the state as a complex machinery that we need to deal with in multiple layers.
And I think also if we take some of the recent changes that have been happening, who were the actors? It was civil society in Sudan that basically overthrew the former government. And it was done through peaceful protests, not that the state necessarily reacted peacefully at all times, but it's not necessary that it's our voice, but their voices as well, which does not necessarily need us to amplify their voices. Trevor, I saw you had a question.
Thank you. My name is Trevor. I'm a sophomore doing a supplementary major in global affairs. My question will go to the IHD lab. I'm taking a global affairs class with Professor Diane this semester, and she's done a great job of helping us understand the concept of integral human development. And my question is about what I'm calling the de-indoctrination of knowledge. When Professor Clemens was speaking about the conceptualization phase of the lab, he spoke of the strategic partners that the lab would draw on. He spoke of the Ford program, he spoke of the Laudato Si Institute at Oxford, and he spoke of Catholic Relief Services, amongst other partners. And in my head, I was thinking, these are all individuals or institutions that are drinking from the same source, even if they might be using different straws. And what I mean by that is that the concept of integral human development, for me, is very radical, but also is an opportunity to reimagine the conceptions of how people across the world interact, how institutions interact, how states interact, and the entire global, international multilateral system. But if we're going to, in the conceptualization phase of this very important theory, drink from the same source, there is a danger of indoctrinating knowledge, because then we're not drawing on voices from other philosophical standpoints, whether it is East Asian philosophy or African philosophy or Latin American philosophy across the board. And that is worrisome, because then it was also kind of reflected in the way it was presented that, you know, when we do this conceptualization with these very important strategic partners, we shall then move and try in the implementation phase to work with guys on the ground in Uganda. Now, I'm Ugandan, and it's very exciting that we're going to be beneficiaries of these programs. But there is an implicit power dynamic in that, which might make sense because there is actual need on the ground where these things are going to be done. But it is in itself a perpetuation of certain ways of, you know, knowledge production, which for me are a little problematic. So I wonder, with the IHD lab, is it important to the lab that knowledge is not sort of monopolized, so to speak? And if so, what sort of initiatives are you going to take to ensure that we are drinking from different sources?
Yes, thanks very much, Trevor. And of course, as always, your insights are very, very sharp. Yeah, in terms of the conceptualization of the Integral Human Development Research Lab, actually the first level, the partners that you have mentioned, that Clemens mentioned those in terms of more implementation. In terms of the conceptualization, what is it? How to describe it? This will consist mostly of a round table of discussions involving not only scholars in the Keough school, but across campus, different programs, economics, anthropology, sociology, because this notion of integral human development is being used by a number of people, not just in theology or in social ethics, it's in business, it's used. So we want to have a set of round tables actually to get a better sense of what does it mean when you use integral human development, for example, in law, or is there something like that kind of concept operative in law? What does it mean? So this will be around the first phase is a set of round tables, not only here on campus, but also involving people from outside campus institutions, and also very importantly, actors, practitioners, not only in terms of institutional government actors, but also grassroots actors. So what we're thinking about in terms of the conceptualization phase of this Integral Human Development Lab is this kind of conversation, bringing us to a better understanding and a better articulation of that notion of integral human development in conceptualization and concept. And then later on, in a way, kind of working with these practitioners and institutions on the ground who are doing something about that, who claim they are doing integral human development, and learning with them and learning from them. But the level of conceptualization is actually a series of conversations. And for us, it's from social ethics and theology. That is already interdisciplinary in a way. But this is really pressing us and pushing us to broaden our research and our conversation beyond these kind of qualitative methods to quantitative methods as well, and see what we can learn together from all these different kind of conversations.
I would add one other aspect, which I think is really important, the notion of accompaniment. And I think that when you said that you're happy as a Ugandan that the organization will be a beneficiary, I think that's incorrect. They're not a beneficiary, they're a partner. And the learning, as Father Emmanuel said, is to go both ways. We don't know everything, they don't know everything, and it's not meant to be Western centric or North American versus, it's meant to be much more holistic. So I think if we can if we can really conceptualize it much more as accompaniment, we are with each other, as opposed to someone is benefiting and someone is giving. You know, there's a donor-recipient relationship. I think that's the important aspect that threads between all of the labs. So I see that our time is up. I want to thank our panelists for their time, and I encourage you during the reception afterwards and to ask them the deep, hard questions that I didn't get a chance to ask, and challenge, because we want these to work. This is a new and exciting time. So please, we want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you all, and thank you to the panelists.